everyone. I have been gone for 2 weeks and now I'm back this week with a very special guest. His name is Mitch Mitchell. That's kind of hard for me to say the CH word for me. Mitch Mitchell. I'm very glad he's with me today to talk about supported employment. Mitch has worked for Camp Supported Employment for over 30 years, moving up the ranks to training coordinator, where he runs training courses and helps companies and organizations to become disability confident. As a supported employment trainer, he supports businesses in embracing a more inclusive and diverse workforce. In 2018, Mitch was awarded the British Association for Supported Employment Practitioner of the Year award. That is great, and I will probably ask you about that. Mitch, how are you today? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you, Juana. I'm fine. And I'm really excited to be doing this with you. I've been absolutely terrified all day, but now I'm speaking to you. I'm sure that there are people out there attending the event. I don't even know they're there. It's just like I'm on a Zoom call with you. It's absolutely fine.
Yeah. You don't really see anything unless you're on LinkedIn or in the studio. I had the chat open here, but I'm not sure if you can see it. So, Mitch, I wanted to ask you about what disability confident means and what it means in supported employment, and how does it help companies to be more inclusive?
Okay. Some of the terms I use, if you don't understand them, because I live in a different country, just tell me and I'll kind of go into a bit more depth. So within the UK, the kind of like the overseeing central government have different departments, and one of them is called the Department of Work and Pensions. That's the department that pays like people's disability benefits and also state benefits when people retire. The Disability Confidence Scheme was launched in 2014. And it's a scheme where businesses can sign up. There are 3 levels of kind of accreditation. The first one is where they sign up first. It's called Disability Confident Committed. And that means that basically they've signed up to the scheme. You've got Disability Confident Employer, which means that employers, give opportunities to people with disabilities, maybe tailor some of their recruitment processes. And you've got Disability Confident Leader, which are employers that have done all the things that kind of on the accreditation, and they're seen as experts in their industry. So they might change some of their recruitment practices. They might do what's called job carving. So banding together tasks that maybe high paid staff do so that it creates a new post for someone with a disability. And as a trainer, I think it's a really great initiative. It's allowed a lot more kind of understanding. Part of what I do is to run workshops. So one of the aims of Disability Confident is to increase the understanding of disability by participating in workshops, and so that everybody with a disability or long-term health condition has the opportunity to fulfill their potential and realize their aspirations. And, work is something that is equality for everybody, isn't it? Like in society, whether we like it or not, we judge people on whether they've got a job or not. And, 40% of us meet our partners in the workplace. Work provides people with status, dignity, and self-esteem. So I think it's a great scheme, and it's been a really great part of my job supporting organisations to become disability confident.
I love that. That's interesting that you mentioned that 40% of us meet our partners in the workplace.
Yeah.
So that if you see more people with disabilities in the workplace, they're more likely to meet each other. And that's a great point that you're making there. And really, you feel so much less alone when you're working with other people with disabilities, when you have a disability yourself. Because I remember for me, it was really lonely. I was always the only deaf person in the workplace. And so I often felt like Okay, so I'm asking for some type of accommodation, like a sign language interpreter, or just to meet with somebody one-on-one. I felt like, well, if I'm the only one asking for this, then why should they do it? Even though
Yeah,
it's law, but around the world, really.
yeah,
But
yeah,
UK and the USA, I can only speak for USA, but accessibility laws apply to UK as well. But so I didn't know. So I learned something new right now about disability confident scheme
yeah,
in the
yeah.
UK. And so,
It's
like,
it replaced. There was a years ago. There was something called. It was like what they called a two-tick scheme. So it was a kind of banner on letter-headed paper that companies could put, and it said two ticks. It says positive about disability, but disability confident has a lot more weight and brevity behind it. I think it's taken a lot more seriously in society because 1 in 5 people in the UK live with a disability. It's like 14.1 million people. One in 5 people, 20% of people live with a disability. So I think it's a great scheme. I really do. And there's been the employers that I've kind of worked with that have signed up for the scheme have been really, really great at embracing some of the concepts that I kind of implement when I train. So offering what's called a working interview. So one of the changes to I don't like the recruitment process. I think the way in which we recruit in society is flawed. It rests on an applicant's ability to pre-populate an online application form and
yeah,
then sit in a room and basically sell themselves. So at the point someone goes for an interview, they've looked at the job description and referenced that in the application form, and then they've sat in a room and talk abstractly about why they would be the best person for the job. And for those of us that have interviewed staff before, sometimes the person that you see at interview isn't the person that you get in the workplace, because there's a big difference between being able to do a job and being able to talk about doing a job. So a working interview is in a common, like we were talking before we came online about my shelves behind me with my CD collection on, right? When I moved up to Scotland the year before last, I needed a carpenter to come in and build the shelves. Do you think I sat him down and said, tell me about a time when you dealt with a complaint? Where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? I wanted to see practical examples of his work so that I could employ him to build the shelves. So the working interview allows someone with a disability, or anybody actually, to be able to demonstrate managing time, taking instructions, working as part of a team, because those are the skills that people need to do their jobs. So the larger employers I've worked with have kind of embraced working interviews. I do a lot of work with the National Health Service, for example. I've done a lot of work with a couple of construction companies, and those are the companies that have, really worthy of disability confident leader status, that have changed their recruitment processes and practices.
yeah, that is so true because I applied for now in terms of interviews, not really being a good gauge for how someone will fit in the workplace. I agree with you. I don't think interviews are a good reflection of how a worker can succeed in the workplace because, for example, my sister works for a nonprofit, and the director of fundraising talked a good talk in the interview. She said she knew all these software programs: Microsoft Word, Excel. What are the other big ones? Those are the main ones for fundraising.
Yeah,
But once she got in the job, she didn't know how to do anything. She didn't know how to do
yeah,
Excel. She didn't really know how to do fundraising very well. And she essentially messed up a lot of stuff that my sister ended up having to fix herself. And my sister is really good at her job. I know it sounds biased, but She really is good. They're always she's gonna get a promotion soon. I mean, but this woman was great in the interview, but lousy in her job.
Yeah.
And it was
Yeah.
just a bad hire. And so that's why. But I've heard other stories too where interviews go great, but you're not going to do well in the job. So it's
Yeah.
really not a good
Yeah. So
gauge of how you're going to do.
yeah, so the companies that have really taken it on board are the ones that I think of. It's led to a more inclusive and diverse workforce, and it's all the things that people can bring to the workplace, different perspective. People have got very, very different life experiences, and more, I suppose, more innovative companies. There's a move towards hiring people that are neurodivergent now. People that are neurodiverse, because
Yeah.
I think that is a new, even though it's not a new concept. Neurodiversity has been around since 1998, but the media have kind of woken up to it, and more the more and more forward thinking companies are like embracing neurodiversity. So because it leads to different ways of thinking, because people with very different perspectives. So I think
Exactly.
we're at a point now in the UK that's probably, I think, the most positive it's ever been for someone that's worked in the industry for 30 years. I think it's a great period of time to work in services and for people with disabilities and supported employment. I think it's a wonderful time, and it's changed an awful lot from when I first started. An awful lot.
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear that. Are there certain industries that a lot of disabled people, I mean, gravitate to? Are there certain jobs that they gravitate to more?
I
'Cause-
wouldn't. I probably wouldn't say, not to pigeonhole anybody, but I wouldn't say so. I think
right.
some industries can be a bit more difficult if generally it's the recruitment process that can exclude people. Like for people with intellectual disabilities, for example, if they aren't able to read the application forms, then they're not able to apply for the job and they're not able to be interviewed. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think the
Yeah.
way, and people that are kind of affected by digital poverty, if they can't buy IT equipment, then they can't job search. So there's still exclusion, but I think on the whole, it's a lot better than it's ever been.
Yeah. I agree with you. Yeah, and if you want to work online, you basically have to have a computer,
Yeah.
software, and it can be very expensive. But there are some services that help people with disabilities to get a discount on things like software and computers here. Do you have something similar there in the UK?
Within the geographical area that my organisation works, there is it's actually someone I've known professionally and personally. She runs, or she's part of a team called Digital Skills Kent, and those guys like provide IT equipment for people that are, like in some way disadvantaged. So there are incentives and initiatives. Yeah, yeah. They're a great team, by the way. Digital Skills Kent, wonderful team of
Yeah,
people.
yeah, that's great. I'm going to check them out. What is her name? I'm going to check.
I'll send you a message after. I'll let you know afterwards. I don't want
Okay.
to call anybody's name out while I'm on the call. There might actually be somebody from that team attending today. So
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Okay, so Mitch, I wanted to know what led to your career in supported employment. And
um, what led to my career in supported employment? When I was at school, I thought I was going to be a rich, famous rock star, and I
ah,
didn't. I didn't. I used to play drums in a band, and my band were rubbish, and I didn't bother studying, and not. I never applied myself, and when I left school, my parents rather sternly told me that I'd have to get a job like the rest of society. and I became a. Do you know what timeshare is?
Timeshare. Yes.
Like the
Yeah.
holiday
Timeshare,
industry.
yeah.
Yeah. So I became a timeshare salesman, and
Oh,
I didn't
that's
like
tough.
it.
That's
Yeah.
very tough, by the way.
Yeah. And in the UK, the timeshare industry had a very, very, very bad name. Very bad name because of the way that stuff was sold. And I worked in timeshare. I kind of worked as a salesman for a while, but I didn't. Someone else has just put that they worked in timeshare as well in the chat. And I didn't like the way in which timeshare was sold. They would do things like give customers a dummy contract with the pen like that, and then you were taught to let go of the pen so that they would catch the pen in their hand, so that they would have the contract and the pen in their hand at the same time. And I worked there for a while, and they said, we want to make people redundant. We want to make people voluntary redundant. And my hand shot up, and I went home and said to my mum and dad, I've lost my job. And my dad went mad. He said, you've thrown your career out the window. What you doing? And I said, I'm not going to do another day's work unless it's something morally that I feel comfortable with. Right. So I didn't do anything for a while. I did get a job as a semi-professional drummer, and I hated it. And a friend of mine was, she was working, it was a government training scheme, and she was working at a residential home for people with intellectual disabilities that had been in the UK in the Victorian times. They built these great big institutions where thousands of people with disabilities would live. And the government started closing them down. And she started working with some of these people in a smaller residential home. And I used to chat to the guys. And one day I turned up and she said, you need to sort your life out and you need to work with disabled people because I think you'd be good at it. And, you know, I was young, I was unemployed. I started volunteering at a day centre for people with intellectual disabilities. Sorry, in the UK, we say learning disabilities. In the US, you say intellectual disabilities. And I loved it. I used to volunteer 5 days a week. I used to get hot dinner over lunchtime. And part of my voluntary work was taking people on work experience. So taking people to different jobs on work experience. And I did that for about 6 months. And then a job came up with Kent Supported Employment as one of the first job coaches. And on the 4th of April, I would have worked for Kent Supported Employment for 30 years. So that was 30 years ago. So yeah, I'm foul musician, foul rock star.
Wow. So you started out as a job coach in
Yeah,
Kent, and then you
yeah.
worked up now to training coordinator. So it really sounds like you found your place.
I think I was lucky. I was lucky to find something that
Yeah.
I enjoyed doing and I was good at, and that it became my career. The days of when supported employment came to the UK, because originally it originated in America. You had a guy called Dr. Mark Gold, who is widely seen as the founding father of supported employment. And it came to the UK in the late 80s, early 90s. And it was people with disabilities didn't work in open employment back then, that people worked in sheltered workshops, in sheltered environments. And it was so kind of hippie and punk at the same time, because it was challenging the status quo. So it was such a great period of time that you couldn't go on. There wasn't really any training to do it back then because it hadn't been done before. Like when you took people out of day services who wanted to work, it would be a bit difficult to explain that to parents because people with disabilities didn't go to like jobs like everyday people did. So it was a great period of time, and I was lucky. I was just in the right place at the right time, and that's why I've always stuck in the industry, because everybody's got the right to work. I told you I wouldn't shut up. I told you I'd talk loads.
Yeah, yeah. No, we have something here called, it's probably similar. I wanted to say hi to some people who's joined us. Jessica, diversity is of any kind is great for the team, needs different points of view to sort
Yeah,
out what might work best. Totally agree
yeah,
with that, Jessica. And that means
yeah,
including people with disabilities in workplace. And then people with disabilities have the same needs as anybody else. They want to feel like a part of the community. And so being in the workplace, a supportive workplace, is a good place to do that. And you spend all of your life, most of your life in work anyway.
yeah,
So
yeah.
Stacy was saying that she was in a rock band. Stacy, I didn't know that about you. That's interesting.
I'm glad you weren't a timeshare salesman, Stacey.
Not time sure she was in a rock band. No, I didn't know that about her. But so Mitch, so recently you was talking about working with a construction company, and
Yeah,
you mentioned something called dynamic disabilities, and you say that there are many misunderstandings about dynamic disabilities. Can you explain more about that? Because it's a
yeah,
new concept, relatively new concept.
yeah. It was a Canadian lady called Brianne Benez who contracted a virus in 2017, and it left her. She basically her flat was mouldy, and it left her with a chronic illness. And she felt that the term disability didn't really help to define how she felt. She said she considered she's a podcast host, and a podcast is called No End in Sight. So a static disability means that an individual's needs and requirements are generally the same, whereas dynamic disability is a condition like multiple sclerosis, for example, where the nature of someone's needs and abilities change depending on, you know, it can sometimes be over a period of time, it can be more frequent. So sometimes people with dynamic disability are prone to what they call a flare, where the symptoms kind of change and become more pronounced, I suppose. And it's I suppose for some people, um, it could be that somebody might need a mobility aid one day, and the next day they may not need it. So if that person is seen one day using a wheelchair for mobility, and the next day they're seen walking down the street, potentially for people that don't know that that person's got a disability, they could say, "Oh, you didn't really need that wheelchair." So it's a lot harder for society to get its head round it and understand, because the nature of disability and the needs change on a daily basis. So the construction company that I work for, I do like what's called lunch and learn sessions for them, where I'm given a topic. And like last week on Friday, I did a session on color blindness or color vision deficiency. So it'll give me something. I ran this workshop on dynamic disabilities, and it was a great workshop for them, because there's not much written about it. Um,
Right.
and I think for people with dynamic conditions, they generally are as a result of a long-term health condition or medical condition that lasts 12 months or more. And in terms of UK law, that's when it is potentially classified as a disability if the symptoms last for 12 months or more. And that means that people are entitled to disability benefits, for example. So dynamic disability, as I say, it's a really, really new term, really new concept. And there's not much online about it. There really isn't. If you Google dynamic disability, it will generally take you to a couple of podcasts and a couple of other people. And I think knowing people that have had and lived with multiple sclerosis, it kind of leads to what they call disability imposter syndrome, that you can be subjected to what's called medical gaslighting, because your condition changes. So someday you might be able to run, you might be able to get ready, you might be able to work, but the next day, if the condition flares up, it leads to people feeling like a fraud in their own body. That's how it was described to me by a friend of mine with MS. So has that helped?
Yeah, yeah, that helps to know that. Does it also apply to, like, if you're working someplace and you develop cancer? Cancer, does it apply to cancer also?
I
How?
think depending on the symptoms of cancer, I did do some work with an organisation that supports um, individuals that have been through cancer treatment, and I can't remember the name of them. They're a multinational European organisation, and I did some training for some of the people there. Um, they called, I can't remember. They called I Know How, and I don't know as if I think dynamic disability. It's because it's not clearly defined. Some conditions probably sit under that banner, whereas other conditions don't. So I think, yeah, probably cancer, people undergoing cancer treatment could potentially be seen as a dynamic condition. Yeah. But I'm no expert on it. I'm really not.
Yeah, I think it was too, because you're going through treatment and then you're taking medication after treatment that causes certain side effects, like maybe
Yeah.
body pain, joint pain. It's common that after some cancer treatments, you're taking the medication. I think any for specific treatment, you're taking
Yeah.
medication that causes side effects. And then, of course, there's always a chance that cancer can come back and cause
Yeah.
other effects also as well. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it sounds like the definition for dynamic disability isn't really clear yet. It
No.
applies to some conditions, maybe not others. So it's all about defining what it really means. But,
And I think during the pandemic, um, a lot of kind of academic and medical research has slowed down. So, what was happening, because, health organizations around the world were looking for vaccines and cures and things like that. So, a lot of academic and medical research, full stop, has kind of slowed down during the pandemic. And it's a good couple of years after the main part of the pandemic now. So, I think that, once we get up running, and I don't know whether, because it's such a new concept, like, it takes language and terminology for disability changes at maybe a slower pace than language and terminology change for other protected groups, for example. So in the UK, we've got what's called the Equalities Act, which looks at, it's basically the Equality Act replaced all the previous legislation, and there are 9 protected characteristics. So you've got age, race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, disability, marriage, civil partnership, and the other one that I can't remember off the top of my head. But whereas, like, some of the things like sexual orientation gets a lot of media attention, disability doesn't get as much airtime as some of the other protected characteristics. So
right.
language and terminology change a lot slower. As I said to you earlier, like, neurodiversity was first used in print in 1998, and it's only now that the media, but I don't know what it's like in America, but the media seem to have woken up to it in the UK. So
It's the same here too. There's a lot of talk about neurodiversity, not enough about disability, which is interesting. Maybe it's because me and you talk about it a lot,
no,
but
no,
it
and
doesn't. It seems like it's not talked about enough. But neurodiversity and gender,
yeah,
sexual orientation, gender, transgenderism is talked about a lot, but not saying that they're not as important as disability. Of course not. They're all important things to be aware of. So it's just a matter of talking more about disability and what we specifically need as people with disabilities. Like, but the problem is that there's so many different types of disabilities that, say, there's deafness, blindness, intellectual disabilities.
Mhm.
I mean, there's so many.
Yeah.
Physical,
Physical
learning.
disabilities,
I mean, so
autoimmune
many. So I think
disease.
that's where people, autoimmune disease.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
oh,
like
that's,
where
I didn't even know. Is that,
oh,
did
I
you say
think that
autoimmune disease?
yeah, so it's where part of the kind of part of the body will view someone's internal organs as being foreign like bodies and will like fight
Yeah,
against them.
yeah,
So you've probably got a different classification
yeah.
for it in the States. I don't know what potentially it's called in the US.
It's called autoimmune disease also, but that I think there's some types of autoimmune disease that can be disabling. Like
Yeah,
multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune disease. Rheumatoid arthritis, when it
yeah.
gets really severe, it can be debilitating and can be considered a disability also. Someone, Stacy says, many people with long haul COVID have become disabled. The gap between the ADA and the reality is a rude wake up call. Yes, we're hearing more about the effects of long haul COVID. After recovering from COVID, you're left with many debilitating symptoms that affect your daily life. We are hearing more about that. And I think that's something that needs to be studied more by
Can I,
researchers.
can I ask a question to yourself and Stacey? What is ADA? Is that the American Disability Association? ADA. Stacey's put it in the chat.
Oh, the ADA?
Yeah.
Oh, the ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that
Okay.
was
Right.
passed,
Right.
the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it was passed in 1990 by our
Wow.
President Bush to protect people with disabilities in all aspects of life, whether it's public, if you need to use public transportation,
Yeah,
whether
that's the
you need
same as
accommodation to work. Yeah,
that's pretty much the same as the Equality Act.
yeah.
You know, transportation, public functions, associations, and work. So it's how
Yeah,
effective is it? How effective is the
that's
ADA?
correct. It's supposed to provide protections and make the country more accessible. That's correct.
Yeah.
And
How
so,
effective is yeah.
yes, it's very similar to your Equality Act.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
protects people with disabilities mainly.
Okay.
So, but generally speaking, no workplace, if you have, I don't think it matters how many employees you have, but any workplace that you're in, they cannot discriminate on any
No,
basis, race,
no.
gender, all of that, religion, all of that anyway.
Yeah.
So the ADA is a separate law that protects specifically people with disabilities. So Mitch, so what? So my last question to you is: what type of company can often be challenging to work with, and whether it's due to lack of awareness, not knowing where to start, and offering accommodations, or making the workplace more accessible? What are some of the things that you share with these companies to help them broaden their perspective and not to be so intimidated by offering accommodation?
I think that I read somewhere that there was it was only 20% of UK employers feel comfortable in addressing someone with a disability, and like that's 1 in 5. That's pretty poor. But I think the biggest thing is showing people that it works. So whenever I run training for employers, I always give examples of people that I personally have supported into the workplace. I think there isn't any particular organization that I've ever found difficult to work with. I think it's just you might need to tailor your approach, because if it's, say, a small company, I think probably the most challenging thing is who to actually start the conversation with in the first place. Like, who do you go to first in order to get in with a company? Sometimes it isn't necessarily people in recruitment, because they follow process. It's maybe going to someone within diversity and inclusion and talking to them and demonstrating the business case. The amount of money that it costs to hire new members of staff in the UK, the average to recruit to the average post I've heard, and it depends on what you read, cost about £5,000. That's just the cost of advertising the post, the time it takes for the HR team to sift through applications, the cost of interviewing. Earlier on, you said the cost of bad hires. So people that aren't up to company standard, don't make their past their probation. It's demonstrating the business case, and it's tailoring your approach depending on each employer. What might work for one company won't necessarily work for another company, and it depends on the size of the company. But I don't think I don't think it's just, I suppose, and the words I never use when I train are you must or you will, because you don't change hearts and minds by quoting legislation. It's around demonstrating the business case and being positive about it. So yeah, those are my tips anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it probably puts people on the defensive if you say you have to, or you have
Yeah,
to do it because it's the law.
yeah,
So I feel like it's better to appeal to their sense, maybe their empathy. What would you
yeah,
say?
yeah.
Appeal to their empathy, appeal to their, well, really the bottom line is about money, making money. So
Yes. It,
if you can say, oh, you'll save money by doing this and this and this, they're more likely to do it. What do you think?
yeah, I think that it's demonstrating the business case. I mean, you hit the nail on the head there, Joanna, by saying that an employer's primary function is to make money. Without doing that, they're going to go bust. So it's the demonstrating the business case that by working with our organisation or supported employment organisations, potentially we can save you money. People will stay in roles longer. If you think about, I think for people with intellectual disabilities, for example, when it comes to recruitment selection, they're at a massive disadvantage. They can't necessarily, they may not be able to read the application form. They may not be able to fill it out. They may not be able to articulate fully why they're the best person for the job. Traditional interview methods disadvantage people. So by working with these people, they're far more likely to, by offering people opportunities, they're far more likely to stay in work. So it's just, I suppose it's the business case, and you don't change. There was a guy that trained me years ago, and he was a brilliant, brilliant trainer. He worked for the British Association for Supported Employment. And he said, every time you pick up the phone to an employer, you're putting pressure on them because you're asking something. Every time you say, I want to talk to you about recruitment, blah, 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 you're putting pressure on them. And having that training, and that was probably I think that was one of the things that really impacted on my practice, someone telling me that, because I'd never thought of it like that. So it's around what's in it for the employer. It's around the business case.
Right. And then if you have happy employees, you have lower turnover. So I
Yeah,
think that's more appealing for employees too. So Jessica says, I'd say it's done minimally here, but I'm not directly impacted. So I may not always realize where the gaps are. Yeah, I obviously the law isn't always enforced. That's why you're seeing more lawsuits, ADA lawsuits now here than in the past, because people are speaking up more about their needs and not from more awareness within
Yeah.
NISA, what they can do if their rights are being violated in the workplace. So we're seeing more of that here. And I think with many invisible disabilities, which is another section, are those to disclose because of discrimination, failed by something else in at will work state. At will is when, I don't know if you have something similar in the UK, Mitch, but at will is, and it's in the contract that you sign when you work for a company. At will employment means they can fire you for whatever reason, for any cause. It doesn't matter. And a lot of companies have that in their contract. And when I was starting out in my career, well, I didn't have a career. I had a job at this computer place. I was working in administration in this low position. And what does that sound? I don't know what that was.
Oh, I
Anyway,
think it was my. I
oh,
think it was something coming
sound.
through my electronic calendar. It was just something reminding me. So no, it's
Oh,
fine.
okay. I thought, what was that?
That's a me problem, not a you problem. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it.
Okay, okay. Okay, so on my contract was at will employment. So they could lay me off, fire me for whatever reason without cause, whatever, basically do
Mm.
whatever they want for whatever reason. You didn't have to have a reason to fire or lay somebody off. But they weren't providing accommodations for me for meetings. So I ended up suing them. This was a long time ago. I ended up suing them. But you can still sue even if you have at will employment. If you're
Yeah,
fired.
I don't tend to deal with that side of things. I think there's a valid point about disclosure, that a lot of people are worried about disclosing their disability. And if somebody within the UK, nobody has to disclose their disability at any point. There's not a legal obligation. But if somebody does, and again, it's those words, an employer must consider their requests. And I don't like using the word must, but that's what the law states. That's what the law states. And I think disability disclosure generally is still pretty low. It's still pretty low. If you think that 1 in 5 people with a disability, in the UK, and yet some of the organisations I've heard that their disclosure rate is between 2 and 10%. So the maths doesn't add up there. It should be around 20%, but there we go.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the fear of losing work if you disclose anything. And maybe it affects your work on some levels, but maybe it's not noticeable to your employer. I guess you feel like you can get away with it in some way, but it must be very hard to have an invisible disability and feel like you can't disclose it. I mean, imagine the stress that comes along with that.
And pretty much when we were talking about dynamic disability, pretty much every dynamic disability is an invisible disability as well. So it kind of I suppose the potential fear of stigma and discrimination kind of works with people with invisible disabilities as well as people with dynamic disabilities. So
Yeah. So Jessica says traditional interview methods disadvantage people with disabilities. I can only imagine how much more challenging that is for those with disabilities. Definitely.
yeah.
Definitely. I mean, as a talking as a deaf person, I mean, interviews were a nightmare for me. I mean, the best interview I had was take this test and we'll see how you did and you'll be hired. That's the best type of interview because, as I said before, I mean, you can do great in an interview, but not do great on the job.
Yeah.
So, no, that's
And
the best interview.
some companies kind of embrace a group interview setting where they get a number of candidates around in the same room and they do like team building.
That's a
Because
nightmare.
yeah, like sometimes some of the questions are so abstract. Like, if you were a flavored sandwich, what flavor would you be? That's one that I've supported somebody through, and it was just like, what does the interviewer actually mean by that? What do they mean by that? So
I don't know. I feel like that's a trick question. Like they want you to answer in a specific way, but I don't know what the
I
hell. I mean, it's just too much of a guessing game there.
yeah,
And then
and I remember supporting a guy once to go through an online application form, and it was the first question was, "Have you ever told a lie?" That was the first question on an application form. What's the correct answer there?
oh yeah, I lie all the time. Yeah, I'm a complete liar. And then but not gonna hire me based on my answer to one question. It's so ridiculous. I feel like also companies that do interviews don't know how to conduct interviews. They haven't a clue.
Someone once told me years ago that not everybody interviewing will be very good at it. Not everybody that's actually interviewing somebody will be a good interviewer. And it was something I've always kind of remembered, that, there's a real skill to interviewing people properly.
I think so. I agree with that. That's something. If you're going to interview candidates, you should assign someone that has pretty decent interview skills, and then you ask important questions, not dumb questions that feel like
Yeah.
they're tricking you somehow, that there's a secret answer to this question that makes
Yeah.
no sense.
Yeah, we need to know that you can say this, or that you're a people. They, like for the group interviews, companies that conduct those, they don't want somebody that talks all the time, and they don't want somebody that's quiet. They want somebody that can, in a group setting, bring out the answers to everybody. So that's what they look for at those things, because I've kind of I know people that work, and I've done some research on it as well. That's what they look for when they ask you what flavored sandwich you are, or they want you to do a team building exercise. So
Jessica says it's very difficult to bring a lawsuit and prove wrongful termination. That's why, Jessica, it's so important to have a paper trail. So say, for example, you are requesting, for instance, in my case, I brought a wrongful termination lawsuit for my work not providing sign language interpreters for meetings that we were required to attend. And so they just never provided one. And so there was, I guess, not a paper trail, but they had to admit that they were not providing it. And one was
right,
never, an interpreter was never hired. And so, plus I had a really good lawyer, so that helped a lot. So the key is finding a good lawyer and who is well versed in disabilities and workplaces not being accommodating. She's a specific lawyer that I found, and I was very lucky to find her. So it is about the lawyer. Find a good lawyer, and if you can, leave a paper trail. That's very important.
right.
So, so if you are somebody with disability and you're not getting the accommodations you need, start documenting everything and writing it down. And if changes aren't being made, you can't sue them, even while you're working for them. That is up to you. But if they lay you off or fire you, then you definitely have cause, even if
Yeah,
you have at will employment, as I did. And
yeah,
so,
yeah. That's good advice to know. Good advice to know.
yeah. So, Mitch, I thought the last question was my last question, but no, this one is.
Oh, right,
So,
okay,
can you
splendid.
give me an example of an employee having being successful in the workplace through your intercession? Can you tell us about one of those
Ooh,
time?
I think for me, the last person that I kind of supported into work before I stopped, doing that was somebody that he and he's an autistic guy, and he's got a very, very high IQ, but he just wasn't being successful at interview. He said he was very, very, he went for a couple of interviews, and he said to me the interview he was very, very like kind of, I suppose, not very happy by the interview process. He said it's flawed and it rests on an applicant's ability to sell themselves. He was, like sell themselves on that day. And he worked, I got him a work experience placement working for a financial team with an organization. And he started off by doing a 3-week work experience placement. And he got a placement with the internal audit team. So looking at, he's very, very academically bright. And they didn't really want any kind of accommodations in the workplace. They just wanted some awareness training around his condition. So I did some autism awareness training. And he went on to, he's basically doing what we call a level 7 apprenticeship, which is the equivalent to a master's qualification. I'm not sure what that is like in America. But he won an award for being the most promising apprentice of the year. And he's now a disability confident ambassador with the organization. So he looks at some of the signage that the organization puts on construction sites and, like kind of gets them to make them more easily understandable for people on the spectrum or, neurodiverse people. I've done some like years ago when I was working with people with intellectual disabilities, some of the accommodations that I put in the workplace. There was a guy that worked in one of the post offices, and part of his routine was he couldn't remember the order of he basically did the post round in the building, like the internal mail, and he couldn't remember the names of the offices and the order that he had to go in. So I kind of put together with him a job aid, which was basically a folder with the rooms in sequential order and dividers. And it meant that I made it so it fitted in with the company's branding so that it didn't draw any attention to him. Because I think sometimes any accommodations that are made for someone with a disability need to be kind of discreet and not draw attention to that individual's disability. So I think over the years, all the things that I've kind of done have kind of, that's where I've got to be a trainer. They're all the things that I've done over the years that when I run workshops for practitioners, I can like kind of reference. So many things over the years, Warner, so many things.
Yeah, I think that's so great. I love what you do, Mitch, and really, it makes me happy to hear how much you're helping people in the workplace, people with disabilities. And so, because really, I truly believe that everyone, disability or not, we all have certain place that we belong.
Yeah,
It's just a matter of finding that place where we belong. So,
yeah,
I was wondering now. Another question I was thinking of is, so in the workplace, if you have a person with disability that's being provided accommodations, how does this affect other employees in the workplace? Do you find that they respond well to people with disabilities in the workplace
yeah.
overall? They do?
It's positive. There are some employers that have turned around and said it's changed people's perspectives, and it's made the workplace a much nicer environment. Certainly, I've had employers that have quoted me that, and I've used it on training courses. People have spoken up and come forward. I think when it comes to accommodations, and like we make accommodations for everybody in the workplace, like if you've got kids and you've got to go and pick them up from school. That's an accommodation that's made. That's a workplace adjustment, isn't it? So not all kind of accommodations need to be massive. You know, I worked with somebody that didn't like commuting at the time of day when everybody went. You know, they had to get a bus to work, and the bus was rammed full of people. You know, a simple adjustment was change the person's work hours. Instead of starting at 9, start at 10. Instead of finish at 5, finish at 6. So not all accommodations have to be made that big. You know, sometimes it's the little things that we do. If, for example, there are people that I've worked with that, you know, there's a couple of people I work with ADHD that weren't able to, you know, in order to help them maintain focus with their jobs, instead of giving them an hour lunch break, you give them 3 20-minute breaks during the day, and it helps people to make. So it's not all accommodations are massive. Not all accommodations need, you know, specialist equipment, and some do. There's people I've worked with. There was a lady that I worked with years ago with a visual impairment, and during the summer months, she could catch a train to and from work like no problem. But in the darker months, you know, when there was less light, because of her visual impairment, it left her quite vulnerable when she caught public transport and when she walked, you know, to and from the train station. The Department of Work and Pensions run a scheme, the Access to Work scheme, helps people with disabilities with accommodations. So they basically subsidise taxis for her to get to and from the train station so that she wasn't vulnerable. So it depends on the individual, really. Depends on the individual.
Yeah, that's a great point, that not all accommodations have to be this major big thing. That
Yeah.
it's a matter of making minor adjustments that can make your lives easier.
Yeah.
So, Mitch, I've really enjoyed our chat this morning. We're coming up an hour already. The time really passed quickly.
Wow, it's really
Yeah.
good work.
So,
Yeah.
do you have any maybe one tip that you can give recruiters, because you mentioned that the recruitment process needs work. So do you have a tip that you'd like to provide to recruiters that might be listening in?
Just to give people a chance and think outside the box. And in the words of my hero, Dr. Mark Gold, always try another way. Always try another way. There you go.
Yes, it does require thinking outside the box. Because so many of the rules that we follow every day are not really meant for everyone. So it does require new kinds of thinking from people who think differently, right?
Yeah, there you
Yeah.
go. There you
So
go.
I hope thank you everyone for joining us this morning, and I hope you have some good takeaways from this. And if you ever want to get in touch with Mitch, who is in Scotland, I have his information in my post below, so feel free to give him a ring or DM him or however you want. Thank you very much for joining me. And next week I have a surprise guest, someone who is a disability writer. And so I'll be talking with her next week. And so thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Joanna, thank you. You've been a gracious host. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for listening.